Hi friends and welcome back to Haas of Props. In today's video I'm going to make this Viking inspired shield which has been on my to-do list for a while now. The shield is completely EVA foam, has wooden supports, and features this Jörmungandr dragon stencil detail. Before we start building, if you would like to help support this channel, you can buy merch featuring 3 versions of this design from the link in the below description. Every little bit helps and is appreciated. Now let's get started. We're going to start with 2 of these 10mm foam floor mats. The ones I'm using are textured on one side, so I'm going to place this texture on the inside of the shield. I'm using 2 mats so the shield will have extra support and you won't get that embarrassing foam wobble that would happen with only one mat. On each textured side, I'm going to apply a heavy layer of contact cement. While I do this, go ahead, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you can see future builds coming to this channel. Or if you're able to, scan this code so you can have the channel on your phone for when you're on the go. Once the mats are coated, I speed up the drying process with a heat gun. Otherwise, I would have to wait for the surfaces to become tacky naturally. When the cement was ready, I aligned the mats, ignoring the puzzle piece edges, and pressed the 2 together firmly. Then using a utility knife, I proceeded to cut out the shield shape I had previously traced using the template. Once the circle was cut, I marked the planks and proceeded to use a yardstick with the utility knife to make sure I got straight cuts. This next step might seem redundant because now we are going to glue the planks back together with the contact cement. Trust me, there's a method to this madness. These cuts will help create the illusion of wooden slats by the end of the project. The circle for the grip can be scaled to fit your hand. When you have the size you want, trace it onto the shield and cut it out. Next, I use my rotary tool with a sanding drum to carve the wood grain. To do this, hold your tool at an angle so just the edge of the drum is touching the foam and create the wood grain shape you want. The more you push down, the deeper the line will be. On the back, I outlined where the supports will be placed and then proceeded to use the same wood graining technique. When the grain was finished, I cut a piece of 2mm foam that was 3 inches wide and long enough to wrap around the outer edge of the shield. To do this, I work in small sections by applying contact cement to about 6 inches on both the 2mm foam and the shield, attaching this area, and then repeating with the next 6 inches. Once the piece was attached completely to the outer edge, I repeated the process so I could attach the rest of the 2mm foam on the facing and the rear of the shield. When pressing down, I tried to keep the foam flat and avoid wrinkles. Then I marked the front of the shield where I wanted to carve some battle damage and claw marks. These were carved the same way as the wood grain, and I had a couple overlap the edge of the wrapping just to give it a little bit more texture. To give the shield some extra support, I got 3 paint stir sticks from the hardware store. The 2 thinner ones will be placed on the outer sides, and the longer, thicker one will be used in the middle as both a support and the grip. These are glued onto the rear of the shield with contact cement. Next, I wrap the grip with a strip of 2mm foam and glue it in place with CA glue. The dome which covers the grip is called the boss. To start building this area, I cut a ring of 6mm foam by using the template. Then I use my rotary tool to smooth and round off the edges. This ring can then be glued down with contact cement. I created a dome with the 6mm foam by heating up the foam and shaping it over the rounded part of a bowl. Once it was cool, I then attached this to cover the opening over the grip. To give the surface texturing to look as if it's hammered steel, I'm using this tip on my rotary tool. By gently pressing across the surface of the boss, it will create little divots which resemble hammered steel. I then used pieces of 2mm foam to cover the wooden supports. By pressing the foam around the edge of the wood, it will create a look similar to stretched leather when painted. Next, I use a hole punch to cut a lot of little circles to use as pins and nail heads across the leather. Before attaching the nail heads, I use this tip on my rotary tool to create a slight ridge. The nail heads will be placed inside the ridge. I use a drop of CA glue at each spot where one of these nail heads will be placed, and use tweezers to put the foam on top of the drop of glue. On the front of the boss, I repeat the process with the nail heads around the 6mm ring. And repeat the process yet again around the front of the edge wrapping. Here I ended up placing the heads about 2 inches apart, but you can do this to whatever distance you want. Along the center of the supports, I'm using these pieces of 6mm foam to create a metal pin. I glue them in place. On the front, I also attach pieces and try to make them align so they look like they go straight through the wood. Once they are all in place, I use a sanding drum on my rotary tool and sand them down to little more than a nub. At this point, the build is complete, so I use my heat gun to seal the foam before proceeding. This will help open up some of that wood grain texture as well. Once it's ready, the shield is sprayed with Plasti dip. You want to build up the surface with thin, even coats, that way you avoid any drips. Once the Plasti dip is dry, I base all the wood areas with a burnt umber acrylic. Make sure to press the paint into all the wood grain grooves. The leather areas are based with a raw sienna. This looks very yellow, but when we're finished it will look like aged leather. Next, I mix a tiny bit of burnt umber with white and dry brush this across the wood in the direction of the wood grain on both the front and the back. Now using burnt sienna and chestnut, we are going to add aging washes to the wood. I start with the chestnut. You want to thin out the pigment with a decent amount of water and apply this across the wood, but not over all of the wood. You want the paint to be thin enough so you can see the dry brushing underneath. I use a paper towel to blend my edges so I don't end up with brush marks. When I'm finished with the chestnut, I repeat the process with the burnt sienna. To add more aging, I'm going to apply a jet black wash around the edges of the leather and the boss on front and back. A little black goes a long way, so I make sure to really thin out my edges with a clean, wet brush. I use nutmeg brown to make a wash and paint over all the leather surfaces. This is the first step to toning down the yellow of the raw sienna. Once that wash has dried, I brush on a layer of thinned burnt sienna. By thinned, I mean just a little water is added, but not enough to make it a wash. Then using a crumpled paper towel, I dab the surface. Make sure to dab and not wipe. Here you can see how the crumpled paper towel leaves behind a textured surface. We want this across all leather surfaces. Once that layer is dry, I apply a jet black wash on the leather in a similar way to the wood. The only difference here is I blend by dabbing with a paper towel and not using water. I try to only add the black in areas that would get a natural dirt buildup over time. After I cut out the Jörmungandr Stencil, I center it on the front of the shield. Make sure you keep the eye and the nostril pieces and tape them where they belong. I mix a little bit of Windsor blue with a decent amount of white to get my desired color. I then take a dry brush and pounce this across the openings in the stencil. I want it to look weathered, so I'm making a point to not paint the area solid blue. I want the wood to show through in some spots. When finished, I lift the eye and nose pieces with a hobby knife and peel up the stencil. The last detail I want to add to the wood is painting inside the battle damaged grooves with a mix of burnt umber and white. This will make these areas look like fresh damage in the wood. I then brush jet black on all the pieces that are supposed to look like metal. Then using a metallic sterling silver and a paper towel, I buff the surface of the boss, making sure to leave some of the black showing. and then brush the same silver across the pins and nail heads. The final paint step was to age the metal surfaces with a wash of chestnut. And there you have it, a Viking inspired shield with a custom Jörmungandr design on the surface for some added protection. The back is just as detailed with the leather wrappings and metal accents. I hope you enjoyed this project as much as I did. If you did, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to Haas of Props. You can get this design and support this channel by purchasing merch ranging from t-shirts to phone cases and stickers. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at Haas of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.